Oh, it's a responsive crowd. This is going to be fun. I'm Jeff Schlatter. I'm the director of the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, and I'd like to welcome you here and thank you for coming this evening. One of the things we do is science. We like to call it something like science to save the lake, but it's trying to understand what's happening in the lake and in the watershed here, and pass that information on to the agencies who are responsible for managing it. Part of what we do as well is education, whether it's education for school children, for the general public, and for people who, like you, who live in the greater Tahoe area. So this is our monthly lecture, and so we're very happy and proud to present it. I like the idea of science intruding on people's lives. Not intruding in a negative way, but science being a part of their lives in many ways. In the same way, I think art is and should be a part of people's lives. So tonight is very special because we're actually getting a merging of science and of art. So tonight's speaker, some of you may know him, is Bill Fox. I have to try to remember this now. He is the director of the Center for Art and the Environment at the Nevada Museum of Art. It's really great to have Bill here. He was actually out with us on one of our research boats about a month or two ago. Turk has been interacting for the last couple of years with the Nevada Museum of Art, trying to further this interaction between science and art. So I'm looking forward to Bill's talk tonight. With that,
Joe, thank you so much. I get warm because I kind of roam about. I'm going to attempt to stay within my marks here that I've been given for the video camera, or if I do stray a little bit, we'll see how well I do. I was at a dinner party in Los Angeles once about 10 years ago, and I sat down next to a very beautiful blonde woman, and she looked at me and she said, "So I know you're a writer, I understand you're a writer, could you tell me what it is you write about?" And I was somewhat shell-shocked, sitting next to this creature, and I said, "Cognitive dissonance and isotropic spaces." And she looked at me and she nodded, and she said, "I know what each of those words mean, but I have no idea what you're talking about." So we lived together for 5 years after that. It was a lovely relationship. What it means basically is getting lost in big empty places. And the reason I study this is I'm very interested in the evolved cognitive neurophysiology of human beings and how we use that to turn land into landscape. I'm really curious about the art, architecture, and narratives we leave behind in that process. And that's what I study, and so I've been to the Antarctic to write the history of the Antarctic because it's the most extreme place I could think of to go. National Science Foundation was kind enough to host me for 3 months there. So I was kind of ground truthing the images that both scientists and artists were making. It was amazing some of the commonalities between the two. That's not the source or the topic of my lecture tonight. That's another one sometime. So now I've drifted away from writing books full time. I've sort of fallen down to the dark side. I work at this art museum. The Nevada Museum of Art, 65,000 square feet, 4-story building, a 10-year-old building designed by Will Bruder in Arizona. It's in downtown Reno. And it is the only art museum in the world that's dedicated to exploring human creative interactions with natural built and virtual environments. And I run the research section of this museum. Museums typically, they do 3 things. They collect stuff and show it, and then they interpret. That's the education department. First part's the curatorial. And then there are people like me who try to bring together archives and library materials and associated things that usually don't cohabit naturally in the same space, and create a little friction, create a little new knowledge out of that for the sake of the curators, give them something to do. So here's the building, and if this will point it there, yeah, there we go. We have a library, and there's the door of the library, so you can't really tell too much about this room. But in this room is the Center for Art and Environment. It is the only research institute in the world devoted to the study of that subject. We currently have, we're 4 years and 4 and some days months old right now. And in that time period, we have collected materials from more than 500 artists working on all 7 continents. that are working in this realm of interactions with natural built and then a little bit of virtual environments. No? Come on. Speak to me. I'll do it manually. I'm threatening you. Come on. All right. See if I care. No, the computer doesn't want to do it. No, I apologize. There we go. So I may have to stand over here and do this. We'll see. This is the small gallery space that we have. We do 30 to 40 exhibitions a year at the museum. We have 13 galleries, and this is the space that I run in. It's devoted primarily to showing some of the archive materials that we collect. These are materials from and about Michael Heiser, Walter D. Maria, and another land artist named Charles Ross. This figure that's right up here, let's see if we point it, this little guy right here, that's called Complex 1. It's kind of a bunker-looking shape. I'll show you a bit more of that in a minute. It's part of the largest sculpture on the face of the planet. It's in the middle of Nevada. Okay, this is, your video camera's going to hate this. I'm going to be wandering back and forth the whole time. This is art environment too. And this is a painting by Claude from the 1640s that rests on the flight into Egypt. Carol, I don't know, did I have this image in the first 20 years ago? Yeah, okay, it's a different, all right. I moved on then, this is good. And then the organization of the space is something that an anthropologist might look at and say, oh, well, it's conceal and reveal landscape. This is the kind of landscape where traditionally human beings are very comfortable because they've got a bit of foliage to hide behind. They can look out, see what's going on in the midground, which tends to be a water feature and has features in it such as animals or other people, so it's kind of interesting and strategic. And then maybe you've got a long view in the distance. Turns out that is the most popular kind of picture in the world. And it's something that some people say we're hardwired to be predisposed toward from growing up in the savanna and a mixed tree and grassland environment. Well, we talk about that in the library, but that's not what we collect. We don't collect stuff that old usually. We collect stuff like this. This is from a trip with a guy named Matthew Coolidge, who's the director of the Center for Art and Environment. I'm just going to try and fix the computer. This is the Alaska Pipeline. We drove the pipeline. It's 800 miles long. 400 miles of it are above ground. And what we're looking at is how does a really big artifact, a fantastic piece of engineering, how does that alter the landscape, not only physically in terms of the ecology, but also visually, how does it reorder the landscape? And what do people make of this? You're gonna go for me? Okay, great, thank you. So what I'm doing, yeah, exactly, got it working. This is Shiprock, down by the Four Corners area. And this is a photograph made by a guy named Jim Sanborn. And this is another kind of thing that interests us, a different kind of artifact. The Alaska Pipeline is an engineered artifact that hopefully is going to last a long time. Otherwise, it's going to be spilling a lot of oil, which you don't want it to do. And this is an ephemeral art piece. It lasted for one night. Jim Sanborn is the guy who was hired by the Central Intelligence Agency to do their public art piece for the headquarters in Langley, Virginia. There's a program, a federal program, that says you have to spend half of 1% of the construction cost of the building on a public art piece. So Jocko, it's like the Michael Heiser piece in Reno, right? And so he designed these coded pieces, these kind of walls, at 3 different levels of code. First 2 have been broken. The third one, the director has the key. No one's ever broken it yet, which is amazing. But of course, we don't get to see it because it's a public piece of art at the CIA. So how's it public? Anyway, but while Jim was there, he discovered that the CIA had a generator that could throw relatively low levels of light long distances. And he asked if he could borrow one. And they said, what are you going to do with it? And he said, I'm going to project stuff on mountains and rocks and hillsides. And they said, sure. So I dragged it around behind his truck and had a generator, and he would go to places like Shiprock. Now, the thing about Shiprock is you're not supposed to climb it, you're not supposed to mess with it, you're not supposed to be involved with it physically because it's a sacred site. So what Jim did was very clever. He takes the Western cartographic grid and throws it temporarily up on a sacred place. So he's managed to put together a Native American sacred site and a Western colonial construct, if you will. I mean, the cartographic imperative is the kind of thing you use to conquer the world, right? And he manages to put the 2 things together without hurting the rock, without touching the rock, and still making the point. That's a piece of art that really interests me. That's, I think, very nice. So you can see the exposure was a long one, because of the way the star trails are. Okay. The art of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a term proposed by Paul Crutzen, stratospheric chemist, won the Nobel Prize with a couple of other fellows in '95 for discovering the mechanism that depletes ozone in the atmosphere. In 2000, he was at a geomorphology conference, and he presented a 2-page paper, a little tiny, tiny paper. And in it, he said this amazing thing. He said, we're not living in the Holocene anymore. We're not living in the recent era. We're not living in the era just since the Ice Ages, about the last 10,000 years. We're living in the Anthropocene. We're living in a new geological epoch that is created by human beings. And to prove it, I'm going to show you that there is a strata of carbon that's been laid around the world by the burning of fossil fuels since the 1780s, 1790s, roughly when the James Watt steam engine becomes commercially viable and they start digging up lots of Welsh coal. So he proposes this, and I will leave it to the Stratigraphic Commission in London, of course there is one, to figure that out. If it's, I think it's a wonderful, at least a wonderful metaphor, if not an actual change in geological epoch. If it's an actual change, it's bloody fantastic. Human beings as a species will live through a couple of them. It would be really good, from the Pleistocene to the Holocene to the Anthropocene. Anyway, 1790s industrialization, laying down a strata of carbon, and the chemical regime of the planet starts to change a little bit, until we get here to the 1950s, after World War II. And that great military-industrial engine is changed into a pump of consumption, pumping out goods for us to buy, and we really start messing with the chemistry of the planet, and things change a great deal. And then in the 1990s, Earth system science has been around for a long time, but that's when the public begins to understand in a much deeper way, oh, it's all a bunch of systems, and they form one system that's called the planet, and we not only live on it and are subject to those systems, but we're influencing those systems. And thirdly, we can do something about the way we influence them if we pay attention. Click. Switch. Our library at the museum starts with Alexander von Humboldt, pretty much, 1790s, same time period. So I'm going to walk you through 3 stages in the Anthropocene, those 3 stages. And I'm going to propose that there are 3 things that artists do in response to those 3 stages. Artists picture the natural world and try and figure it out, try and picture the great systems of the natural world. Then they picture our footprint on the world. I'll show you examples of that. And then finally they start to act, they start to intervene directly in the situation of the planet, in the system. So Alexander von Humboldt's with his friend Aimé Bonpland, a botanical illustrator from France. And they sail to South America. They go through a French blockade to land in Brazil. They end up in Ecuador. Along the way, they trace the course of the Orinoco. They make the first credible maps of the interior. They collect thousands of specimens and ship them back to Europe. And they climb what is then thought to be the world's highest mountain, Chimborazo in Ecuador. And they get up to about 19,000 feet. And they're in button-up boots, the ones that have buttons, and silk waistcoats and top hats. And they get up, and they're freezing because it's really cold up there. They're in the zone of the eternal snows, right? So they're up here. And the volcano is active, and it's spewing toxic fumes, and they decide to go back down. But what happens is, Humboldt, along the way, says, oh, this is really interesting. The higher I climb in altitude, the more like I'm going away from the equator in latitude in terms of the kinds of plants I'm seeing. And the same thing, that's what I saw in the European Alps when I was climbing there, when I was walking the mountains there. So he begins to derive a notion of the world as having climate zones that are governed by temperature, thermocline, and he starts to make maps and charts, and this is a very early illustration based on these notes, about the different regimes. So you go from tropics to temperate zone to subarctic and Arctic and so forth. And here are the kinds of plants that he would find along the way, the different regimes that are biota. So it doesn't want to do it, does it? My computer's being very rude, my apologies. So he goes back home and he spends his entire Prussian royal fortune on getting the results published in a series of books, more than 20 volumes in the series. They're so expensive he never could afford to set himself after he spent all his money getting them printed. He hired 50 illustrators and people who make nice scripts. How do you call them? Thank you, yes. And painters and so forth to illustrate these things. And they come up with these simply shocking illustrations that correlate latitude, altitude, and they do things like he would put a little farm up here in the middle, so he would say, this is as high as you can sustainably farm. This is as high as human beings basically are comfortable living. And that's how they relate to the scheme of things. It's a fantastic illustration. His work, his illustration, his account of this journey inspires Frederick Church, the Hudson River painter, to go to Ecuador and follow his exact footsteps and stay in the same inns and go on the same trails and to paint these great encyclopedic paintings of South America. This one's called The Heart of the Andes. It hangs at the Met. And I went to go see it because I thought, well, I'm going to be writing about this painting and what I think is going on. And so here's the eternal snows, and here's the temperate zone, and here's the jungle, and here's the hydrological scheme that flows through this entire painting. So it's a painting about colonialism. I mean, there's the cross of the Spaniards who've been there, and it's a painting about a lot of things. It's very important history of art, this painting. When I stared the painting in the face, so to speak, actually it wasn't the face, it was kind of up on the wall, and above the door, I looked at it and I realized, oh my God, he's put that little plume of smoke there. That's a farm, and that's about as high as you would want to live, and you could sustainably. He's copying Humboldt's visual scheme for the world. Stunning to find this. Well, there are other artists who do that. If you look at Thomas Moran's work in Yellowstone and Grand Canyon, same thing, these big encyclopedic paintings. But by mid-19th century, you have the photographers coming on the scene. And this is a photograph by Timothy O'Sullivan. He's accompanying a geologist, a man named Clarence King, who graduated from the Sheffield School at Yale. And he's in central Nevada. This is called, what used to be called Crab's Claw Peak. And King renames it Karnak Ridge after Egyptian. All these things that they found that looked vaguely architectural in the landscape, they would give Egyptian names to, because so we would have monuments of the West, right? We didn't have monuments like they had the Arabs. We had to have monuments of antiquity of our own that were geological. And what's happening here is that Clarence King has Timothy O'Sullivan photographing this because it looks like something violent happened. And what King is trying to do is figure out which theory about the formation of the world is correct. Was it catastrophic, or was it a uniform process over a long period of time? And he's a uniformist. He believes that basically erosion over a long period of time created the Grand Canyon, not somebody smoting the earth and it happens in 3 days. But he's puzzled by these things. He's this is obviously something happened here that wasn't just erosion. Something uplifted these rocks, and he's trying to figure this out. At the end of his life, by the way, he goes back and he gives his last lecture at Sheffield, and he says, I think it's basically a slow, uniform process most of the time, but every now and then there's an earthquake or there's a volcano or something, so there are these punctuations, and of course today we would call that punctuated equilibrium. So it's fascinating to see a photographer participating in a scientific expedition, and those photographs now are collected by the Getty, they're collected by us, they're now art objects. Another picture by Timothy O'Sullivan, and here we have the shift from O'Sullivan picturing the natural world to O'Sullivan taking a photograph of a stamp mill outside of Virginia City, and he's beginning to photograph the footprint of human beings in the world. You could make a photograph in London, that's a big bloody human footprint on the world, but it's not quite so apparent as when you're in the desert and there's nothing else around you, and you see a structure built by human beings, part of the industrialization of the West. Now, so there we are with Timothy O'Sullivan, right, in the mid-19th century. Here we are, this is Lone Pine, this is Ansel Adams shooting up at Mount Williamson and the Whitney group there. So here's our highest point in the lower 48, right? 49, 48, 49. I always get confused. I grew up in Hawaii, wasn't a state, what can I tell you? So this is outside of Lone Pine, and you look at this and you think, wow, here's the pastoral, that's beautiful. Here's the sublime up here. What a beautiful natural scene. Yeah, there's a bit of touch of humankind because that's a pasture and maybe that's been cleared. Someone's put horses out there. But you don't realize what Ansel Adams has done in this photograph to erase the traces of the human footprint on the planet. The letters LP for Lone Pine, which you still see today when you drive down there, are on this hillside. He's dodged them out in the darkroom, so you don't see them. More interestingly is what's right behind these trees. That's the LA Aqueduct. That's what takes water to the San Fernando Valley and made it possible, right? So here's Adams purportedly making this, this beautiful natural scene, and it's a gorgeous photograph. I've grown up with this. I love it. I've wandered all through those mountains for years. Alabama hills. I love these hills right here. All of that. But he's hiding things. I wish I could have asked him. So, Mr. Adams, did you know the aqueduct was there? Were you happy it was hidden? Did you want? Interesting question. So Adams is doing that in the mid-40s. He's actually out there to document the internment camp there, but he's not really so interested in doing that, and he wanders off and does these other photographs. 1949, William Garnett, photographer, has come home from the war, flies across the United States in an Army airplane, and he's so taken by how he sees the landscape, he says, I'm going to get up my own plane, I'm going to become a pilot, I'm going to photograph it. He gets hired by the guy who's building this subdivision. This is Lakewood, California. These 4 photographs appeared like this in the first book from the Sierra Club called This is the American Earth. And they were part of this central rhetorical device where you have the photographs of Adams, including Winter Sunrise, Sierra Nevada. proposing to give us purity, and then you have these photographs showing sprawl, and it's like, look at what human beings are doing to the planet. Isn't this awful? Well, that's a valid argument. It is. It's a human footprint, and it's not such a good thing. On the other hand, I flew over Lakewood with a geographer, Dennis Cosgrove, a Brit, a few years ago before Dennis died. And Lakewood's now the most beautiful suburb you can imagine. It's walkable, it's got trees. All these houses that were identical now look all different because the owners have modified them. So it's always, see, that's the thing about working in an art museum. You're always trying to make the story more complicated, So this is going on. So now you see this cataloging, not of the natural world that you would see in a Frederick Church painting, or even in some photographs by Timothy O'Sullivan. Now you're starting to see this cataloging of the footprint and the process that produces the footprint. And so here we are, of course, the 1950s, the Great Acceleration. These are the Beschers. They were German photographers, and their hero was Timothy O'Sullivan. What they like to do is photograph when it's high, dead light, very few shadows, nothing dramatic about this, and they would catalog things like blast furnaces in Germany in the Ruhr Valley. And what they're doing is they're cataloging that human footprint because it's becoming so evident, so intrusive. Interesting story behind the blast furnaces. You know, Germany met the Kyoto Protocol targets when they were established, very shortly after they were established. The way they did was that they dismantled these furnaces, is one of the ways, and they sent them over to China, where they were put back together again, except without the pollution controls, and then they made the steel and sent it back to them to make Mercedes in Germany. So it becomes a more complicated story. But that's not the story they were trying to tell. They were simply collecting images of these industrial structures of different kinds. Now, while the Beschers are doing that, in the late 1960s, some other people are doing some other things about the human footprint on the planet. And that is they are trying to say, not only can that footprint consist of industrial structures and pastures and pipelines and ditches that take water to Los Angeles, they can be things like this. This is in the highlands of Peru. It's a piece by Richard Long, a young British artist, who became famous by walking a path in the grass and taking a picture of it. And the actual piece of art was the walking, and then all that's left, because the grass the next day simply springs back up, all that's left is a photograph, a trace of that action. So what he does is he goes around the world, he makes very small little interventions in landscape, and takes pictures of them, and that's his artwork. And he makes these beautiful walks, and he photographs us along the way he walks, and he photographs his tracks, and that becomes his artistic record of a footprint in the world. This is at the opposite end of the scale. This is Michael Heiser's city project in Nevada. Remember I showed you Complex 1? That one little photograph there? Oh, that's down here. I want to make that, is that Complex 1 or is Complex? Yeah, no, yep. Yep, Complex 1 is at this end. Okay. So Michael, no, I'm sorry, it's at this end. There's the house, it's at this end. This is 1 mile and 1/3 long. It's 20 feet deep, and the berms piled up along the sides are about 20 feet high. Michael Heiser, what Mike's trying to do is set up a dialogue between Western geometrical forms and Mesoamerican and more organic forms. What he's trying to do is shift the vocabulary of sculpture in this country away from very traditional Western European ideas into something else. So you get these things down here, a bunch of geometrical forms, and you've got this, and I'll show you a close-up slide of this in a minute. And then he's got these other forms that are based on the fact that his dad, who's an anthropologist, took him to La Venta, the great Olmec site in southern Mexico, and what basically Mike is doing is copying a big Olmec ball cork and making it very, very big. So what he's doing is he's proposing something about a different kind of footprint. So Richard Long was moving rocks and making an artistic footprint, an earthwork. Michael Heiser is using bulldozers to do it, but he's also moving around dirt to make a footprint of an artistic kind. That gives you an idea of the size of a truck. This was one of those photographs, Jocko, from that Kimmelman article. So you see, these are almost 70 feet long, these big stelae he's lined up here. So what he's doing is he's putting these Mesoamerican forms, these enormous enlargements of them on the wall. When this is finished, you walk down into it, and you can't see any of the mountains surrounding you. All you see is the piece. He's isolating you from the rest of the world, making you deal with what he's proposing. Now what's interesting is, let's complicate the story again a little bit. Richard Long's little circle of rocks in Peru is going to last longer than this sculpture that's 1.25 miles, 1.5 miles long. Deserts are pluvial places. They're shaped by rain, ironically, right? And rain has been taking apart all this. Every year, Michael has to go back in and reset these berms, and he's invented a kind of concrete to shoot on the surfaces to try and stabilize things. He did a very famous piece called Double Negative down by Las Vegas, about 60 miles out of Las Vegas. And that piece is just these enormous, beautiful cuts in the earth that are about 20 or 30 feet deep and quite long. One of the largest sculptures, again, on the planet. And it's just crumbling to pieces, which exactly it should do. It should make a mark and then it gets erased. So anyway, this will actually not last as long. Here's the sculpture right here. And this is before he planted all of it with native grasses. Now it's virtually invisible. What you see are the cottonwood trees at his ranch, where he raises bison, or beef, no, he raises beefalo, in order to get the tax credit to afford the property and the water. Hanging out in New York City back in the 60s with Michael Heiser and Robert Smithson and all these other guys was a very quiet young woman named Patricia Johansson. And Patricia actually ended up having the first solo show of minimalist art in New York City in the 60s. She married a curator, they moved upstate New York, she had kids, they lived on a farm, and she was confined, if you will, to making drawings of experimental gardens based on things like the snakes that she would see in her own backyard. She did a number of these drawings that were published in a 2-volume set by Harvard a couple of years ago, beautiful drawings. And what she does with those drawings is now move more dirt than Mike Heiser does. This is a tertiary level wastewater treatment plant in Petaluma, California, and it's an art project, in part. This is the head of a mouse that she's drawn for these ponds, a little morning glory down here and so forth. This whole thing is designed as, and this is in process right before it's finished, it was designed to be several things. So it's a wastewater, it's a sewage plant, right? It's designed to be a park, it's a wasteland reclamation area, it's an interpretive thing for the local school kids. It now hosts more biodiversity than it did before the land was even disturbed there. It's been a remarkably successful project. And she's doing projects like this around the country. She's she's mid to late 70s now, so she doesn't work overseas. We've actually talked with her about coming and doing something with the Nature Conservancy along the Truckee River, but she's like, nah, it's just too much travel. I don't think I'm going to do it. So, the Harrisons, Helen and Newton Harrison, they are in their early 80s right now. They kind of invented this idea of we can actually make some art in the landscape that will change and hopefully have a positive outcome within the ecology of a place. This is Santa Fe, New Mexico, and this is the river, the Santa Fe River. How many of you have been to Santa Fe? Yeah, so you know how much water does not flow down the river, right? Yeah, there's a big storm. So what they're trying to do is they took this area as their footprint and said, let's change the planting regime of downtown Santa Fe to slow down rainwater and have a controlled release of it so it flows into the river and gives them a bit more flow during the year. This was actually adopted into the Santa Fe City plan, which is nice. So there are some artists who are actually beginning to influence some policy. They're working nearby, up at Sage-Hen Research Station, which is just up the road from Truckee to the north. This is Independence Lake. A lot of you know where that is. And this is the Sage-Hen Creek watershed. One of the few places in the Sierra that wasn't glaciated. It's, glaciers on either side, as you can see from the shapes of the valleys, but not here. And what they're doing is they're trying to set up a series of plots along Sage-Hen Creek that will, well, what's happening is the temperature of the Sierra is rising. Species are migrating upward. Some of those species will disappear entirely if it gets warm enough. So in effect, the scientists call it the rapture effect. Right? And used to be, I mean, this happened before in the Sierra, and it used to be that there would be a succession of plants and be fine. And the plants that would come up would fill in the niches that Humboldt observed as he was climbing up Chimborazo, right? They fill in those niches, and so water would still be controlled as it flowed down, erosion would take over the range, and so forth. What's happening now is one, the temperature is rising much more quickly than it has before, at least as far as we know. And the events, therefore the precipitation events are not so much snow, as they are more increasingly the rain events. And as the species migrate up and boil off the top of the range, what's coming in behind them are not necessarily healthy species, but often they're things that are not healthy. They're weeds of one kind or another. They're opportunistic plants like cheatgrass, and they come in and they don't really help control the erosion. So what Helen and Newton are doing is establishing test plots where they will try out different ensembles of different kinds of plants that are native to the region that could migrate up, but those pathways for migration were not broken by Interstate 80 and by subdivisions on the west side of the mountains and so forth. Very controversial project. Some scientists say, absolutely, move plants around. I mean, we cause a problem, go ahead and move plants. Other scientists say, no, God, you're going to make the problem worse. Why would you do that? So it's a very, and our role as a museum is to help fund all of the planning and the schematics and the diagrams and the visuals, the artwork around this, convene the scientists together, and document the conversation. If it gets built, we have a 50-year commitment to maintain the results that are coming out of those little test plots, and we'll present them in the museum. So it's a very unusual art project. It's a social practice. It means to intervene with the world and try to achieve an outcome. Atacama Desert, northern Chile. Pretty dry place, second driest place on the planet. Driest would be Antarctica. But this is a place where it doesn't rain for hundreds and hundreds of years. There are some places in Atacama where it's never rained in recorded history. This is right on in the coastal hills. This is the fog that comes off the Pacific, the cold Pacific Ocean every night. Comes in over the warm hills, and it then retreats again in the morning. There's not a blade of grass in this photograph. There's no fresh water source except for what's in that fog, nothing. Now, there are 3 cliffs along about a 200-mile stretch of this part of the Atacama. There's a little cliff right here. Faces just the right direction, so the fog hits it at night, and it's still a warm cliff, and the fog condenses, and water drips down. It's a source of fresh water. Found at the bottom of this cliff is a midden of abalone shells. There's the ocean about 1,500 feet below. People were walking on a regular basis with abalone up here to collect the water at the bottom of that cliff. Crazy. I mean, they want to be great mountain climbers. You know, really fit. So the scientists from Santiago set up a series of test screens to see what would happen if they could collect a little bit of fog. They wanted to measure how much water they could collect, and like I say, what would happen. And they found out that, in fact, there were seeds in the soil that that were still viable, that would germinate, given a bit of water. And they also planted some little test plants to see what would happen. They grew just fine. So then we took a bunch of architecture students from Santiago up and had them talk to the scientists. And they said, well, what would happen if we made a really big screen? And we think we can do this with some muslin and some timber, right? So they came back the next year and they erected this thing. It's just a simple little thing. It's about a little bit taller than I am. And a little plastic trough here. And it collected more water than they could contain, this one device, in a 50-gallon drum overnight. So they were like, okay, this really works. Now, this had been used before as a fog collector. Fog collectors have been used in Namibia, and they've been used around the world. They built some of these down below, and down on the coastline, there are a series of villages. And those villagers they're fishermen for the most part. And they have no source of fresh water, so they have to truck in water from the interior, or pipe it in from the interior. Most of that water is provided by the big mining companies in the interior. The water's not very good, it's very expensive. So about 20 years ago, or 15 years ago, some people went in and built a fog collector for this one village, collected so much water, gave them so much fresh water, not only they have drinking water, and they could bathe and so forth on a regular basis, they also had enough water to grow vegetable gardens and send the vegetables to the other villages in the region. But after 10 years, they stopped maintaining the fog collector, just fell down, it was disused. And they went back to paying a lot of money for piped-in water. So the architects said, what if we designed structures that were so interesting that people who live in that region want to maintain them? So this is an experimental structure. This is shaped like an airplane wing because it creates a Coriolis effect. No, it's not a Coriolis. What's the effect that's caused from
Bernoulli?
Yes, exactly. So what it does is it increases the flow of the air across the surface, and it generates more water from the fog. So they tried all these different experimental. These are architects, not scientists. Architects doing this. The architects from Santiago eventually designed the fog garden. So it is a village of fog collectors that collect, not only very efficient collecting water to grow individual plants or to grow enough water to send down to the village, enough water to send to the village collective. Not only that, but it's an attractive and interesting enough site that the villagers are very enthused about this. Hasn't been built yet. It was going to be built right before the earthquake hit. It's just south of Santiago, and then the government said, no, we don't have the money to do it, we have to wait. But the villagers are like, we love this. We will take care of this. We will venerate this. So the idea is you can have a technology of sustainability, but if you don't have a culture of sustainability to keep the technology going and keep it up and have the technology admired and loved, you're in trouble perhaps. Again, it's architects. So remember, my job is natural, built, and virtual environments. Here's a collaboration of natural and built environment, actually done in a virtual medium. These are CAD, computer-assisted drawings. Here's another water-based project and a conservation project. There's a photographer in Canberra who teaches at the Australian National University, teaches art and ecology there. His name's John Reed. And John Reed would take his students out on field trips into the mountains of New South Wales. And he left his camera out one day along a pond, and the camera somehow got accidentally tripped and took a picture of what he discovered to be the last unknown hominid on the face of the planet, the fish man. Now, so John decides, first of all, he tries to see the fish man in person. He never sees it in person. He can only take its picture remotely. Apparently, he's very shy. So he sets up a camera up in these forests. What's interesting to John about the forest is that these are parts of the ancient forest from when Antarctica was still connected to Australia. So it's part of Gondwanaland, 200 million years old. And the trees that are in these forests are species from that time. Very, very unusual, beautiful, valuable forest. And there's a logging company that wanted to go in and log it. So John was in there documenting the forest because he was upset it was going to be logged and he didn't want to be logged. After 2 years, he presents his results. And he doesn't call it a scientific discovery, he calls it an artistic discovery. And he says, look, it's the last known hominid, lives in an endangered place, we should save the forest. National news comes and covers it. It gets turned into a national park. I've got the cable reefs that John used, 50 feet long, just go in the water to photograph himself nude as he's swimming here with these blurred photographs to make up the fishman story, right? Great project. Great project. Besides that, he got to swim, he loved being out in the forest. So he makes a narrative, he illustrates it, and the story about how he came to actually take the first photograph is even more interesting. But it's this wonderful, and we have this archive. All of these projects I'm showing you, we have the archives at the Nevada Museum of Art, which is why I get to show you these images, even if you can't copy them onto a thumb drive. Project we're doing now, fracking in North Dakota. Terry Evans, an aerial photographer, is working with Elizabeth Farnsworth, the senior correspondent from PBS NewsHour. Elizabeth's a writer, Terry's the artist. And they've been documenting the change in the prairie. We've had a series of blogs up that have been on our internet site. And so the photographs and all the research papers and everything, they'll be shown at the Field Museum. Then they'll come to us. They'll be shown in fall of 2014 and become part of our archives. How are we doing on time?
We're good.
We're good? Usually I'm watching the clock over there or something. This is an artist, Daniel McCormick, from the Bay Area, who does water conservation projects. What he does is he looks at a berm like this. It's a stream bed. And he'll put some material down on it to promote growth. He will create a sculpture by weeding willows or other plant material. Makes this beautiful sculptural object in the landscape. And of course what happens is it starts to grow. It stabilizes the stream bank. The art disappears, but the positive outcome is left behind. We're just now collecting the archive from this. So I'm going to show you a long project. We've got several slides in a row here. Australia, some of you know I love Australia very much. I go there frequently and work. I've been working in a place called Lake Gregory, which is right at the end of this little watercourse here in the Great Sandy Desert, northern Sandy Desert, southern Tanami. You fly to Brisbane, that's about 14 hours, 13 hours. Fly to Alice Springs, maybe 3.5 hours. Get in a four-wheel drive truck, drive for a day and a half on dirt roads to get to this place. Very remote. 150 people live there, Aboriginal people live there. Very modest community. This is Lake Gregory, it's a terminal desert lake. This is Pyramid Lake, basically, of Australia, or one of them. They have a lot of terminal desert lakes there, but this is a big one, an important flyway for waterfowl. And this lake, in one form or another, has been there for a very, very long time. This is Sturt Creek, that's going to become important, and that's Sturt Creek that flows into the lake. On the edges of the ancient lake, the Paleo Lake, there are these stream beds, and that fed into the old lake and still carry water down into the existing lake. And the archaeologists here have found work stones that are 50,000 years old. It's led them to call this the oldest site of human continuous cultural production in the world, or one of them. So this town of Mullen, with 150 people by this terminal desert lake, sits in a place that has very, very old traditions. But these are people who have not made much art about it. They've done body decorations, they've danced, the dancing makes patterns with their toes in the sand. Those are ways they transmit stories from generation to generation. Some of you will have heard of song lines in the Dreamtime. This is part of that tradition. So I've been working with a series of artists, both white and Aboriginal, in the community of Mullen, and they are painting both the Dreamtime story of that place and then contemporary paintings. This is Shirley Umery, and she is painting a story about the scientists working along the lake. Terminal Desert Lake, and they have wild horses. Feral species, not supposed to be there. Horses are breeding like crazy, no competition. There is a possible connection between the shitting that the horses are doing on the shore of the lake and the parasites are now showing up in these perch. That's a major food source for Shirley and the people in Mullen. So she's painting the fish with parasites in them, painting the sinus encampments, and the Aboriginal people in the sinus are working together to catch fish, to dissect them, to help understand the life cycle of the parasite. This is another kind of story that they're painting. So this is a people who have never painted before. This is not part of this big tradition that you find in Alice Springs and Papunya and other places of the dot paintings. These are people who are not trained as painters, not had this tradition since 1970 like the others. Kim Hood's one of the white artists, a Cartier artist, and she has painted a simple topographic representation of Sturt Creek as it flows into the lake and goes by this archaeological site. And she's saying to the women with whom she's worked for years, would you like to paint your story on this map? Because that's what she's been doing. They've been painting stories on these maps that she makes. And the women are going, no way, this is men's business. It's Dreamtime story. It's their story. The men have to paint it. And the men who are standing back here are like, wait a minute, we're not painters. We're guys. We don't do that. The women win. The women win. And the men are sent down into the creek bed with these 5 individual canvases with her map on it, and they start to paint. Right? They start to paint the dreaming story. This is what they paint. It's a stunning piece of Aboriginal art. The story is that there are 2 dingoes are chasing an emu. Here's where they take the emu down. The emu tracks in. The dingoes continue up, and they jump into the ground, which is where this water hole is, very important water hole, with soak, right? And that's part of their story. What this painting represents, like so many Aboriginal paintings, is a map of bush tucker, so the kind of food that you find there. When you're allowed to go use the bush tucker. It says something about territory. It says something about which people live on which side of the stream and who really can talk to whom. It's a very complicated, very sophisticated representation of transgenerational knowledge.
Now, does the color play into that?
Absolutely, color means everything. Yeah, so some of the colors are specific to the bush tucker. The background is red because the ground there is red, as you saw in that picture of that gray green. Every single thing in this painting is meaningful. Every single thing. This is not, so what they do is they paint this painting. So here's this painting, and then Shirley's painting, and some other paintings I'll show you. And I don't know if I've got the other paintings in this slide set. And when they finish this, the men say, this is the first time we painted our dreaming story like this. We've never done this before. We have to keep the painting. And I had arranged for someone to come in and pay the artist so we could buy the painting, so they come to Reno, so they enter our archive collections, and they can be shown here in fall of 2014. And they said, could we paint you another painting? We'll do another one. And I said, that would be fantastic, thank you. So they painted 2 of these. One is coming to Reno, the other is staying with Mullen, town of Mullen. So, I could show you some more paintings. The really wrenching paintings, the difficult paintings to deal with. And the dream time, so I had to be taken out into the lake, introduced to the great serpent that lives in the lake, be painted with mud, be given a skin name, before they would let me take any of this stuff out of the country. It's because, like, Bill, you're taking country. A painting to an Aboriginal person isn't a representation of country, it is country. You are taking some country with you. You have to be part of us. We have to know how to. They had me draw them on a mud map, right? They put me down the edge of the lake and say, where's Reno? I said, where do you want me to start? And they said, Las Vegas. Great, okay. Los Angeles, Las Vegas, San Francisco, Reno, here's the lake, you're not. So I said, we want to come meet your people. I said, well, you come meet the pirates at Pyramid Lake. And so we're trying to do that. We're trying to get funding to bring a couple of the guys out, 2 of the senior men out to meet the people in Pyramid Lake. This is Maya Lin. And Maya was just here with Jeff. That's why I was out on the boat. We were out on the lake. Maya Lin, probably all of you know the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C., which she designed when she was 19 years old. She was an architecture student. And she's actually currently working on her 5th and last memorial called What is Missing. I'll tell you what that is in a minute. One of the things that Maya's been doing recently is making these systematic landscapes. And they are topographical representations. These are 2x4s cut on end. 2x2s or 2x4? I think they're 2x4s. And stacked up to make this mountain shape. So she's dealing with, here is a seamount done in wire. This is University of Washington in Seattle at the Henry Gallery at the university. So she's starting to deal with geological forms. This is the Colorado River, done in reclaimed silver. It's about 1,500 pounds of silver. I have no idea how much that's worth. It's a lot. It's in a hotel in Las Vegas at City Center, actually. It's an enormously long, beautiful representation of the river. So here, she's dealing not just with a feature, she's dealing with an entire river. So she's dealing with a system at that point. And this is made out of, this is the Hudson River. And go ahead and go one more image. That shows you how dense the pins are that she's using. We're doing a big survey show of Lake Tahoe in 2015. It's the first time that anyone's ever done an exhibition that's going to track the entire visual history of the lake, at least in terms of white people's civilization. So I'll start with cartography and survey reports and so forth, move through the 19th century paintings and drawings, and go through Ansel Adams when he was here and everything else. And then we've commissioned artists, contemporary artists, to make pieces about the lake. And what Maya wants to do is do basically Lake Tahoe, the pyramid in the pins. She'll do that entire water course and talk about the watershed. She wants to be, among many artists in this region, she wants to bring people's awareness up more consistently about the nature of one system that runs from Tahoe to Pyramid Lake. Several artists will be dealing with this, I think, in this exhibition. I think there's one more slide, maybe. Yeah, you know what that is. Explain that. That's a couple of years ago. It's about 50,000 people. Great aerial shot. I've been going to Burning Man since 1992. I think it's fascinating. I think it's now the world's largest nonprofit desert educational program, as well as an interesting art project and a social phenomenon and a bunch of other stuff. It's a great laboratory. And I just agreed last week to accept the archives from Burning Man.
Wow. That's an undertaking.
I'm a little concerned. It's very large. I mean, it's things like, as I've been telling people, the unburned foot of the man from 1992. The first sign, the first blueprints, the first schematics for how they were going to lay out the public facilities, all the bathrooms and everything. It's really, really a stunning archive. And to me, I mean, what's going on here is this is also art and environment. And I say it's a desert educational program because, as you know, if you've ever gone or you've been around the website or you've talked to people who've gone, everything goes in with you, everything comes out with you. So it's a leave no trace operation. I bought the transects with the BLM for a book one time, and the desert's actually cleaner than it was before the camp was erected. Because the ranchers and the people using the roads and the ATVers and stuff leave stuff all over the desert out there, and the burners come in and actually clean it. There are impacts on the surface, to be sure, but they don't seem to be terribly bad. They don't seem to be too bad. I don't know how long it can go to continue to grow. I don't know. This is a question that nobody knows. Larry Harvey says 1 million people. The guy who started Burning Man, I think he's out to lunch, but you know. But 50,000 people seems to be that seems to be okay. So this represents an intervention in the landscape of a very high order. In that, you have to put a system out here to interact with the great system of a dry lake bed of the playa. You have to put a system of public utilities, social order, aesthetic appreciation, environmental appreciation. So to me, this is as interesting, let's say, as the Fog Garden project. It's another big desert project that's really interesting. It's also cognitive dissonance and isotropic spaces, which kind of keeps me happy. Okay, so those are all the images I'm going to show. I'm going to stop there. And I don't know what time it is, but do we have time for questions? How are we doing on time?
Yes. It's 6:50, so we have time for questions.
Okay, all right, great. Yeah.
Some of the images you've shown this evening, I think I recognize from your exhibit, Altered Landscapes.
The Jim Sanborn photograph is in that collection. Yeah, I think that's the only image I showed. But so the museum has 5 collections, major collections. The archive collections is one. The largest collection in terms of pure objects is the Altered Landscape collection. It's more than 1,000 photographs of how we've altered the surface of the earth. The photographs run from the new topographics inspired by Timothy O'Sullivan in the 1960s up through now. So, yeah, so it's good that you would recognize
Yeah,
that.
it was a phenomenal exhibit.
Oh, thank you. That's good. Yeah.
What's the best way to follow up on what you're doing? Because the latest part of your presentation was about things that are going on currently and with the Burning Man, and I want to know how to follow up.
How do we follow up?
How do a visitor here tonight follow up with you and what your ongoing projects are?
Oh, great. Good question. Well, we try to get as much stuff up on the website as we can, including future exhibitions. We post the archives that we're collecting in online. You can go see the finding aids, so you can see what we're actually collecting and processing as we're doing it. I mean, the goal of the Center for Art and Environment is well, we're going to try and have enough materials by 2020 so that you could study what happens with art and environment over a number of years, so you can make kind of a longitudinal study. We say, I want to know everything that was going on in 1973. So that's an ongoing developing project that project involves both the library and the archive. We're the fastest growing part of the museum, so we may have to build another building. So I mean, really, it's like I'm out of storage space at the end of the summer, and that's before the Edward Bertinsky photographs from the oil project that you may have seen in the museum come in the door. And they're 50 enormous photographs. We don't know where we put those. So we've got to build storage. We've got to move our parking lot site and make that a sculpture garden of some kind, and then we've got to put the Center for Art and Environment in this other building. So there's going to be a lot to follow. And just so you know, by the way, scholars come from around the world and artists come from around the world to look at these archives for their own projects, whether that's an academic treatise on what's going on, or it's an artist saying, I want to have working tools to know how to affect the environment somewhere. So it's a very actively used archive.
One thing that you didn't show that I've seen at the museum that was quite interesting from an artistic as well as scientific point of view, and I think it was work that the Harrisons were doing about as the polar cap is melting, the potential for water rising, and they had drawn on topo maps the different water levels, and they were stunning.
Yeah. That's part of their series called the Force Majeure. And the project I showed you here in the Sierra Nevada Station is part of the Force Majeure. But we have a huge amount of the Harrison material, and we did that one show with a big Sierra Nevada map. And
when I was walking on that and realized that I was walking on art, and I almost had a heart attack when it was actually meant to be walked.
Yeah, we made it to the Harrisons wanted you to be able to walk. They want you to be able to get down on your hands and knees and crawl around on a 30-foot long, the highest resolution image of the entire state ever made. And to the point where if you have a magnifying glass, you could pick out piles of stacked timber. I'm glad you engaged it like that. I'm glad you had that kind of like, ah!
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. And back in the plaid shirt,
I guess, the whole subject matter tonight seems to be something that's consistent with what Andy Goldsworthy's work appears as. I was wondering if you had any opportunity to work with him.
With whom?
Andy Goldsworthy.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you're just showing a small sliver of all the
I have about 11,000 images I can show you from this, what we're doing there. So you're right, it's a little tiny sliver. We do have an Andy Goldsworthy piece in the collection. We have not interacted directly with him other than simply to buy a piece. He's a really busy guy. He's very famous and very busy, so he's not someone we would probably try and interrupt in what he's doing. Also, he has a huge archive in our main archive is in Scotland. He has a duplicate archive in San Francisco at the Presidio. So he's actually put himself within reach if anybody wants to go kind of find out more about his work. And of course, he's well published. So, but yeah, we love his work, and we'd love to have more of it if we ever get around to buying more.
Is that Presidio archive publicly accessible?
I don't know if it's open yet, but the papers are there and will be publicly accessible. Yeah.
I was going to comment on Burning Man. During your presentation, I was curious if you would mention it because it's local and
Right.
It is huge.
Right.
Last year it was 60,000, and they've gone to lottery.
Well, they did not have gone back. Lottery didn't work. So,
It sure did.
Yeah, it didn't work, yeah.
But the other curiously with this is not only you take in, you have to take out, but the immensity and size of the pieces that are brought and how they have to bring them on what roads, because you can't get on an underpass and that. And so even that extension of how it affects.
Well, it's changing 4th Street in Reno, which is where they build the big projects now because they can't get them off the freeway. Yeah. It's a very big scale thing that we're dealing with. But also the Daniel McCormick pieces would fit in this room, so we deal with smaller. So we like those notions of scale, from put your arm around something to something that's that big. So yeah. Yes.
Is it possible to summarize the lines of inquiry that land artists or artists working with landscapes are trying to deal with currently?
A bunch of people trying to write books about that.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, seriously, because they all come to see us to look at the archives. Part of it has to do with the difference between size and scale. Size is an absolute, simply what is, and then scale, how we perceive it, like how we relate to it. That's an arc of inquiry that everyone seems to be fascinated by. There's a new word, and I just wrote the entry for it in Oxford Encyclopedia of Aesthetics. It's a word called geoaesthetics. And it was coined in the early 2000s. It's barely, I don't know why they asked for someone to write about it, because the word barely exists. But it's an oddly apt word in that it tries to encompass everything from looking at a rock and liking what it looks like, to the evolutionary templates that may have been wired into us by where we grew up and why we like certain kinds of art or don't. I mean, some anthropologists and some folk will argue that what makes a landscape beautiful is whether or not human beings can sustain themselves in it. That's a Dennis Dutton, you can read him. It's an interesting argument to make. I'm not sure it holds up, but it's an interesting argument. The land artists are increasingly fascinated by food production, distribution, and consumption. If I had to say one thing, it's that the environmental movement's almost dead. It's almost moribund in a way. The food movement is vibrant and is perhaps going to carry forward many of the aims of the environmental movement because everybody gets food. Or doesn't. But they understand. So I mean, and land artists are very curious about this. We have one artist who's been working in Rio de Janeiro in the favelas, and she's been, along with a team of local kids, cleaning up the people just throw the trash out in empty lots and it just stacks up. Well, that actually can create fertile soil and also contaminate it. But anyway, so they clean up these things and turn them into gardens. And then the gardens actually grow food that you can use to feed the local kids. And that's a social practice project. So the answer is, there are multiple lines of inquiry. They're all going on at the same time. It hasn't stopped anything else that's going on in the art world. You know, when photography was invented, it didn't stop painting. You know what I mean? So social practice doesn't stop people from making paintings or photographs. It's yet one more layer of artistic intervention in the world, or attempt to move beyond representation and actually do something. So, really sloppy answer, yeah. Comes to this.
Curious, as a novice in this space, I find it interesting that when humans make larger than life artistic, in quotes, artistic pieces of work, such as Mount Rushmore or the Nazca lines in Peru, and maybe that wasn't even created by humans, or more recently in the United Arab Emirates, you've got the Sheikh having created artificially man-made islands made up to look like a palm tree that you can see from outer space.
Yes.
To the extent that these are artworks that are an attempt to leave a permanent imprint of human existence on Earth, is that a subject that would be of interest to the museum? Does this, really?
What's of more interest to us is that those things don't last. There's a guy named James Terrell who's resculpted a crater in Arizona, Rodin Crater Project. He's the same age as Heiser and all these other guys. So he's an earthworks artist. And he has tried to make the construction rise up to an engineering standard that will last 10,000 years. And you have to laugh. It was the same thing when I toured Yucca Mountain years ago in the early stages of that project. And the engineer sat me down and said, we've modeled the climate for the next 10,000 years, we know what it's going to do. I was like, no, you haven't. You don't have a clue. And they finally said, well, you're right. We just sort of, But, so it's of interest that people still have this pharaonic impulse to build things that are really big, that they think are going to last a long time, for monuments to whatever, good or bad, right? But so it's of interest to us that impulse still exists. But I can't think of anything that's, that's going to last that long. Things just, the pyramids wear away. They just don't last that long. So it's an interesting issue. So, by the way, the Nazca lines, I meant to you. Yeah. The Nazca lines, yeah. So there's a guy named Gary Urton from Harvard who finally unscrambled a bunch of the Nazca lines. And we did it with GPS and a bunch of people on the ground, a bunch of people in the air, ground penetrating radar. And it turns out that most of those features point at where subsurface water comes to the surface at different times of the year according to the runoff in the Andes. And those pathways are mostly that. They're walked pathways that are ritual that you perform at a certain time of year in order to make the water rise. And there's a long story of archaeological discovery about how they untangle all this. But definitely made by humans with brooms and sticks and string. No guys from above. And they perform a vital functioning. What's interesting, that's why I tell you the Richard Long circle will last a long time. It's not going to go away very fast, that modest little gesture, whereas Michael Heiser's big piece, I think, will erase. Yes?
Is there a particular thing that you're trying to influence, this whole discipline is trying to influence towards some particular end goal? Or just recording, you're just recording with...
Our job is to collect it, record it, and make it available for people to look at. We don't have I have really personal intense feelings about all sorts of things, but that's not the agenda of the museum or the agenda of the Center for Art and Environment. So we had this long discussion about, do we use the word environment? Because people are going to think, are you environmentalists? Well, personally, yes, we are. But that's not the job of the museum, and it's not the job of the center. The job is to collect. So we have a person who worked, you all saw the landslide in the Bingham mine. I don't know if you saw that, the big mine fell down. She was working in a mine as an artist, and she tracked copper coming from Nevada all the way to Wendover, where it's put on trains, and it goes to the coast, it's put on ships, it's taken to China, it's transshipped inland, it's smelted, turned into copper wires strung from the Three Gorges Dam to Beijing. All she did was take 70,000 images of that, cut it down to about 7,000 images, string them together as if they were a movie with ambient sound, no commentary. So it was all it did was document the path of that copper. All along the way, you saw beauty, you saw human despair, you saw poverty, you saw engineering triumph, you saw all of these different things. I think it's a great project because she didn't have to say anything, she just showed it to you. And you approach it and you go like, oh, that's awful. Oh, that's beautiful. Oh, that's interesting. And that's kind of, I think that's my job, is to bring those materials together and make them available for people to see them. And to put her film next to somebody who's working in an Atacama mine, to put that next to someone who's working on a fracking project, and I don't have to say anything, so just let everybody sort it out. Yeah. Jocko.
This is might appear to be, excuse me, a deceptively simple question, and there might, I think, be
the man who never says anything simple.
and many easy answers, and one of them being your geographic location in Reno next to the natural feature I'm asking about. But why does so many of these things and projects and people happen in the desert?
Ah, yeah. Cognitive dissonance, isotropic spaces. Artists love a blank slate. It's like, oh my God, look at the Black Rock Desert. So I can make William Lamson make Burning That Line in the Mojave. It's a big, and not only that, I can do that and it will go away. Eventually it's just going to go away. So I can make a mark and I can record it and then I can walk away and feel good about it. And people can see it. So that's part of the attraction. The other part of the attraction is human beings like being lost. I mean, it's really terrifying. Actually, genuinely being lost is really scary. And I get actually lost in New York City more than I get lost. That's another story. But we actually like being disoriented. Maybe that's a fair way to say it. Because it takes us somewhere we haven't been before to see something that we haven't seen. And I think artists are attracted to working in an environment like that where it is potentially very disorienting. And then at the same time, they make a mark that kind of starts to order things. So you find artists going to every kind of extreme environment in the world now, seeking that. So Jeff is standing up. I have a feeling my wind-up time is approaching. Is there one more question, or are we? Is it time to drink wine? Can I have wine? Thank you very much.
I just wanted to thank Bill again for what was a very beautiful and a very, very thought-provoking lecture.
Thank you so much.
Again, thanks for having me.
View in the distance. Turns out that is the most popular kind of picture in the world, and it's something that some people say we're hardwired to be predisposed toward from growing up in the savanna and a mixed tree and grassland environment. Well, we talk about that in the library, but that's not what we collect. We don't collect stuff that old usually. We collect stuff like this. This is from a trip with a guy named Matthew Coolidge, who's the director of the Center for Art and Environment. I'm just going to try and fix the computer. This is the Alaska Pipeline. We drove the pipeline. It's 800 miles long. 400 miles of it are above ground. And what we were looking at is how does a really big artifact, a fantastic piece of engineering, how does that alter the landscape, not only physically in terms of the ecology, but also visually, how does it reorder the landscape? And what do people make of this? You're gonna go for me? Okay, great, thank you. So what I'm doing, yeah, exactly, got it working. This is Shiprock, down by the Four Corners area. And this is a photograph made by a guy named Jim Sanborn. And this is another kind of thing that interests us, a different kind of artifact. The Ionesco pipeline is an engineered artifact that hopefully is going to last a long time. Otherwise, it's going to be spilling a lot of oil, which you don't want it to do. And this is an ephemeral art piece. It lasted for one night. Jim Sanborn is the guy who was hired by the Central Intelligence Agency to do their public art piece for the headquarters in Langley, Virginia. There's a program, a federal program, that says you have to spend half of 1% of the construction cost of the building on a public art piece. So Jocko, it's like the Michael Heiser piece in Reno, right? And so he designed these coded pieces, these kind of walls, at 3 different levels of code. First 2 have been broken. The third one, the director has the key. No one's ever broken it yet, which is amazing. But of course, we don't get to see it because it's a public piece of art at the CIA. So how's it public? Anyway, but while Jim was there, he discovered that the CIA had a generator that could throw relatively low levels of light long distances. And he asked if he could borrow one. And they said, what are you going to do with it? And he said, I'm going to project stuff on mountains and rocks and hillsides. And they said, sure. So I dragged it around behind his truck and had a generator, and he would go down. I get it warm because I kind of roam about. I'm going to attempt to stay within my marks here that I've been given for the video camera. Or I do stray a little bit, we'll see how well I do. I was at a dinner party in Los Angeles once about 10 years ago, and I sat down next to a very beautiful blonde woman, and she looked at me and she said, so I know you're a writer, I understand you're a writer, could you tell me what it is you write about? And I was somewhat shell-shocked, sitting next to this creature, and I said, cognitive dissonance in isotropic spaces. And she looked at me and she nodded. And she said, I know what each of those words mean, but I have no idea what you're talking about. So we lived together for 5 years after that. It was a lovely relationship. What it means basically is getting lost in big empty places. And the reason I study this is I'm very interested in the evolved cognitive neurophysiology of human beings and how we use that to turn land into landscape. I'm really curious about the art, architecture, and narratives we leave behind in that process. And that's what I study, and so I've been to the Antarctic to write the history of the Antarctic because it's the most extreme place I could think of to go. National Science Foundation was kind enough to host me for 3 months there. So I was kind of ground truthing the images that both scientists and artists were making. It was amazing some of the commonalities between the two. That's not the source or the topic of my lecture tonight. That's another one sometime. So now I've drifted away from writing books full time. I've sort of fallen down to the dark side. I work at this art museum, the Madden Museum of Art, 65,000 square feet, 4-story building, a 10-year-old building designed by Will Bruder in Arizona. It's in downtown Reno, and it is the only art museum in the world that's dedicated to exploring human creative interactions with natural built and virtual environments. And I run the research section of this museum. Museums typically, they do 3 things. They collect stuff, and then show it, and then they interpret. That's the education department. First part's the curatorial. And then there are people like me who try to bring together archives and library materials and associated things that usually don't cohabit naturally in the same space, and create a little friction, create a little new knowledge out of that for the places like Shiprock. Now the thing about Shiprock is you're not supposed to climb it, you're not supposed to mess with it, you're not supposed to be involved with it physically because it's a sacred site. So what Jim did was very clever. He takes the Western cartographic grid and throws it temporarily up on a sacred place. So he's managed to put together a Native American sacred site and a Western colonial construct, if you will. I mean, the cartographic imperative is the kind of thing we use to conquer the world, right? And he manages to put the 2 things together without hurting the rock, without touching the rock, and still making the point. That's a piece of art that really interests me. That's, I think, very nice. So you can see the exposure was a long one, because of the way the star trails are. Okay. The art of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a term proposed by Paul Crutzen, stratospheric chemist, won the Nobel Prize with a couple of other fellows in '95 for discovering the mechanism that depletes ozone in the atmosphere. In 2000, he was at a geomorphology conference, and he presented a 2-page paper, a little tiny, tiny paper. And in it, he said this amazing thing. He said, we're not living in the Holocene anymore. We're not living in the recent era. We're not living in the era just since the ice ages, about the last 10,000 years. We're living in the Anthropocene. We're living in a new geological epoch that is created by human beings. And to prove it, I'm going to show you that there is a strata of carbon that's been laid around the world by the burning of fossil fuels since the 1780s, 1790s, roughly when the James Watt steam engine becomes commercially viable and they start digging up lots of Welsh coal. So He proposes this, and I will leave it to the Stratigraphic Commission in London, of course there is one, to figure that out. If it's, I think it's a wonderful, at least a wonderful metaphor, if not an actual change in geological epoch. If it's an actual change, it's bloody fantastic. Human beings as a species will have lived through a couple of them. It would be really good, from the Pleistocene to the Holocene to the Anthropocene. Anyway, 1790s industrialization, laying down a strata of carbon, and the chemical regime of the planet starts to change a little bit, until we get here to the 1950s, after World War II. And that great military industrial engine is changed into a pump of consumption, pumping out goods for us to buy, and we really start messing with the chemistry of the planet, and things change a great deal. And then in the 1990s, Earth system science has been
Oh, it's a responsive crowd. This is going to be fun. I'm Jeff Schlatter. I'm the director of the UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center, and I'd like to welcome you here and thank you for coming this evening. One of the things we do is science. We like to call it something like science to save the lake, but it's trying to understand what's happening in the lake and in the watershed here, and pass that information on to the agencies who are responsible for managing it. Part of what we do as well is education, whether it's education for school children, for the general public, and for people who, like you, who live in the greater Tahoe area. So this is our monthly lecture, and so we're very happy and proud to present it. I like the idea of science intruding on people's lives. Not intruding in a negative way, but science being a part of their lives in many ways. In the same way, I think art is and should be a part of people's lives. So tonight is very special because we're actually getting a merging of science and of art. So tonight's speaker, some of you may know him, is Bill Fox. I have to try to remember this now. He is the director of the Center for Art and the Environment at the Nevada Museum of Art. It's really great to have Bill here. He was actually out with us on one of our research boats about a month or two ago. Turk has been interacting for the last couple of years with the Nevada Museum of Art, trying to further this interaction between science and art. So I'm looking forward to Bill's talk tonight. And with that,
Joe, thank you so much. I guess for the sake of the curators, give them something to do. So here's the building, and if this will point it there, yeah, there we go. We have a library, and there's the door of the library, so you can't really tell too much about this room. But in this room is the Center for Art and Environment. It is the only research institute in the world devoted to the study of that subject. We currently have, we're 4 years and 4 and some days months old right now. And in that time period, we have collected materials from more than 500 artists working on all 7 continents that are working in this realm of interactions with natural built and in a little bit of virtual environments. No? Come on. Speak to me. I'll do it manually. I'm threatening you. Come on. All right. See if I care. No, the computer doesn't want to do it. No, I apologize. There we go. So I may have to stand over here and do this. We'll see. This is the small gallery space that we have. We do 30 to 40 exhibitions a year at the museum. We have 13 galleries, and this is the space that I run in. It's devoted primarily to showing some of the archive materials that we collect. These are materials from and about Michael Heiser, Walter D. Maria, and another land artist named Charles Ross. This figure that's right up here, let's see if we point it, this little guy right here, that's called Complex 1. It's kind of a bunker-looking shape. I'll show you a bit more of that in a minute. It's part of the largest sculpture on the face of the planet. It's in the middle of Nevada. Okay, your video camera's going to hate this. I'm going to be wandering back and forth the whole time. This is art and environment too. And this is a painting by Claude from the 1640s that rests on the flight into Egypt. Carol, I don't know, did I have this image in the first 20 years ago? Yeah, okay, it's a different, all right. I moved on then, this is good. And then the organization of the space is something that an anthropologist might look at and say, oh, well, it's conceal and reveal landscape. This is the kind of landscape where traditionally human beings are very comfortable because they've got a bit of foliage to hide behind. They can look out, see what's going on in the midground, which tends to be a water feature and has features in it such as animals or other people, so it's kind of interesting and strategic. And then maybe you've got a long